Today I'm sharing how to make this chocolate Nutella cake. So this cake has a lot of different components. It's made with chocolate sponge cake layers, which are soaked with a chocolate simple syrup. And the recipe for the cake layers and all the buttercreams are up on Chelsweets.com. So I wanted to frost the cake in kind of an ombre effect, so I started with my darkest buttercream, which was a black cocoa buttercream. Once it was nice and smooth and had an even layer, I added a ton of melted Nutella and also some toasted hazelnuts. I repeated this process with my remaining cake layers, and on the next cake layer, I added my Nutella buttercream. So while 3 frostings may seem like a lot of extra work, they're all made out of the same base vanilla buttercream, so it's really just adding in a bit of extra cocoa or a bit of Nutella, or the last frosting is just plain vanilla buttercream, so it's not as much work as you'd think. I was definitely very generous with my Nutella drizzles between my layers because that is one of my favorite things in the world, but if you're not as big of a fan or you don't want it to be too sweet, you can always drizzle a little bit less. I topped my 3rd layer with a bit of vanilla buttercream like I mentioned earlier, and I also wanted to point out that for this cake I actually toasted the hazelnuts that I'm adding in between the layers. It really adds a great dimension and kind of more depth of flavor to the cake and also a great crunch. So even though it takes a little bit more effort, I highly recommend toasting them. Once the layers were all stacked and nice and straight, I smoothed out any overhanging frosting using a small offset spatula. Next, I coated the outside of the cake with some Nutella buttercream. I chose to place my buttercream into a large piping bag and pipe rings around the sides of the cake. And this is not mandatory, but it makes it a lot easier to evenly distribute your frosting around your cake, and therefore also a lot easier to get nice, smooth sides. I started off using my large offset spatula, and then I finished the job using my bench scraper. I let the cake chill in the fridge for about 5 minutes, and once the frosting was firm to the touch, I added a second, thicker layer of frosting. I like to start by adding my extra frosting to the top of the cake, smoothing that out, and then kind of working it down the sides. But there's no right or wrong way to do this, so whatever way you're most comfortable with works great. If you want to see a more in-depth tutorial on how to frost a cake with perfectly smooth sides, feel free to check out the link above. I chilled the cake in the freezer for another 5 minutes until it was nice and firm, and then I used a small offset spatula to begin adding dabs of my colored buttercream onto the cake. To keep things simple, I added one color at a time and chilled in between so that I could layer some of the buttercreams on top of each other. Then to smooth out some of the dabs of buttercream, I used my bench scraper to scrape away any excess frosting. I added my remaining white and Nutella buttercream into a piping bag with a Wilton 4-bead tip and piped some double swirls around the top. The next step is to place some Ferrero Rocher truffles carefully on top of each frosting swirl. I felt like the cake needed a little something extra, so I added a partial drip using some warm chocolate ganache. If you want to see a full tutorial on how to add chocolate ganache drips onto a cake, click the link in the upper right corner of your screen. And after that, I was finally content with how the chocolate Nutella cake looked. So now that it's fully decorated, it's time for the best part, to cut into the cake. So this is probably one of the best slices of cake I've ever cut and will ever cut in my life, so definitely appreciate how straight it is. And you can see all of the beautiful ombre frosting layers. So that's all there is to it. If you guys want the recipe, don't forget that it's up on Chelsweets.com.